World War II was the bloodiest conflict in human history. Tens of millions perished and much of Europe lay in ruins. For German soldiers captured on the battlefield, captivity meant uncertainty, fear of beatings, starvation, or even execution. But for nearly 400,000 German prisoners of war held in the United States, the reality was shockingly different. They ate meat, fruit, and even chocolate, luxuries that many Americans themselves struggled to find during wartime rationing. For the Germans, life behind American barbed wire camps was not the nightmare they had expected, but a strange and unexpected lesson in humanity. From the deserts of Tunisia to the hedgerows of Normandy, German soldiers found themselves taken prisoner in staggering numbers. By the end of the war, nearly 375,000 German POWs were housed in the United States. They arrived in convoys under heavy guard, not knowing what awaited them on the other side of the ocean. The first large groups of German POWs arrived in America in 1942 after the defeat of Rommel's Afrika Korps in North Africa. Ships carried them from Algeria and Morocco to ports like New York, Norfolk, and New Orleans. From there, trains moved them inland to huge camps in Texas, Oklahoma, Colorado, and the Midwest. As the trains rumbled through the American countryside, the prisoners were stunned. They had been told America was weak, suffering, and racially divided. But what they saw through the barred windows told a different story. Fertile farms, endless supplies, and towns untouched by bombs. Many later wrote in memoirs that they were shocked by the abundance of food they saw even at small-town train stations, carts of fruit, bottles of milk, and advertisements for products unimaginable in wartime Germany. One German officer remarked, "It was hard to believe this nation was at war. Everything seemed full, wealthy, and free of destruction." Upon arrival in camps such as Camp Swift in Texas, Camp Atterbury in Indiana, or Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, the prisoners faced their first surprise: food. Meals typically included meat once or twice a day, bread, butter, coffee, potatoes, beans, and sometimes fruit. According to Geneva Convention rules, POWs were entitled to the same rations as U.S. soldiers. In 1944, this meant around 3,000 calories per day. One prisoner later wrote, "We could hardly believe it. There was meat, vegetables, even dessert. In Germany, our families stood in line for hours to get a loaf of bread. Here the enemy gave us more than we had at home." Another recorded in his diary, "Chocolate. They gave us chocolate. For years we had not even seen it. For many Germans, captivity in America brought the first taste of luxuries they had been denied for years. Oranges from Florida, buttered rolls, and sweet chocolate bars. America built more than 500 prisoner-of-war camps across the country. Some held thousands, others only a few hundred. Behind barbed wire fences and watchtowers, German POWs lived in wooden barracks, crowded but safe, with showers, medical care, and a steady routine. Each day began with roll call. Breakfast included eggs, bread, and coffee. Some men were sent to work on farms or in logging crews, others stayed in camp. Afternoons were filled with soccer games, reading, or classes. Dinner might include beef stew, potatoes, vegetables, or pie. For many young German soldiers, some still in their teens, American captivity was the first time they experienced regular meals, clean showers, and medical care. To solve labor shortages during the war, America employed German prisoners as workers. They picked fruit in California, harvested wheat in the Midwest, and cut timber in the South. Under the Geneva Convention, they were paid in camp scrip, which they could spend at canteens on cigarettes, toiletries, and even candy. One prisoner wrote home, "We worked in the fields side by side with American farmers. They treated us fairly, sometimes even offered us food from their own kitchens. It was nothing like the horror stories we had been told." A Kansas farmer later recalled, "Those German boys worked hard. We paid them fair, and my wife sometimes baked bread for them. They were just young men, far from home." Inside the camps, guards sometimes showed films, Hollywood classics or newsreels. Prisoners heard swing music and jazz for the first time. Some took English lessons. For young Germans raised on Nazi propaganda, this was a shock. "We had been told America was ruled by Jews and criminals," one prisoner reflected. "Instead, we saw ordinary men laughing, playing baseball, and sharing food. It was confusing, and for many of us, it planted seeds of doubt. Not everything was harmonious. Camps sometimes had factions. Hardcore Nazis who tried to enforce loyalty and ordinary soldiers who just wanted to survive. In some cases, pro-Nazi prisoners threatened or even killed fellow Germans who seemed too friendly with Americans. At Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma, in 1943, a German prisoner suspected of being anti-Nazi was murdered by fellow POWs. U.S. authorities cracked down, executing the perpetrators and tightening camp security. Still, compared to the brutality of many wartime prisons, such incidents were rare. Most German POWs in America remembered their captivity as a period of unexpected safety and even comfort. Through the Red Cross, prisoners were allowed to send letters home. They could not describe military matters, but they wrote of their health, their work, and often, their astonishment at the food they were given. One letter read, "Dearest Anna, do not worry for me. I am well fed and in good health. We even eat oranges here and chocolate. I wish you and the children could share what I have." These letters astonished families in Germany who were struggling to find even bread and potatoes. Some could not believe the stories. Others wondered if America truly was the land of plenty. From the pine forests of Minnesota to the cotton fields of Texas, German POWs found themselves scattered across an unfamiliar continent. By 1945, the United States had constructed more than 500 camps in nearly every state. Major sites like Camp Swift in Texas and Camp McCoy in Wisconsin held thousands, while smaller branch camps housed men near farms and factories. To the prisoners, America seemed endless, an ocean of farmland and cities untouched by war. For men who had left behind bombed-out villages, the contrast was staggering. The U.S. Army placed thousands of young American soldiers in charge of guarding the prisoners. Many were barely older than the Germans themselves. Some had been wounded in combat and reassigned to POW duty. Others had never left American soil before the war. One guard remembered, "Most of those Germans were just kids. They followed orders, they didn't cause much trouble. We treated them decent, and they respected us for it." Relations between guards and prisoners were often surprisingly relaxed. Strict rules kept both sides cautious, but moments of humanity were common. A guard sharing a cigarette, a German helping an American with farm chores. For men trained to kill each other, the ease of captivity sometimes seemed unreal. Sports became another outlet. Soccer, handball, and even boxing matches were regular events. Some camps built full-size soccer fields, and matches drew curious local civilians. "When we played soccer for a moment, we forgot we were captives," one prisoner wrote. The barbed wire disappeared, and we were back on a field at home. Prison camps became schools. Many prisoners took classes in English, mathematics, or vocational skills. Universities such as the University of Kansas and University of Nebraska helped design educational programs. Some prisoners later credited these classes with opening their minds to new ideas. "For the first time, I read books that were banned in Germany," one recalled. "It was like breathing fresh air after years in a cellar." Music also thrived. Prisoners brought instruments or built them from scraps. Choirs sang folk songs, orchestras played Beethoven, and camp theaters staged plays. At Camp Aliceville, Alabama, POWs organized a symphony orchestra and staged operas. Local Americans who attended were astonished by the quality. In these moments, the boundaries between enemy and host softened. For a night, the war seemed far away. Food remained the most powerful symbol. Rations included fresh meat, milk, bread, and vegetables. Desserts such as pie, pudding, or cake were common. Chocolate bars, Coca-Cola, and chewing gum were sometimes distributed, especially for work details. One prisoner confessed, "When I tasted chocolate again after years, I nearly cried. It was as if I had been returned to childhood." In a Europe of empty shelves and ration cards, America's abundance was a devastating propaganda blow against the Nazi image of a starving, weak opponent. Every prisoner could write home twice a month. Letters carried the most important message: "I am alive, I am safe, I am fed." For families in Germany, still enduring bombing raids and food shortages, these words were almost impossible to believe. When the war ended in May 1945, German POWs knew their fate was uncertain. Many feared revenge or forced labor, but the United States began a gradual process of repatriation. By 1946-47, most had been returned to Germany. Before release, many were required to work helping rebuild Europe. Some were transferred to Britain or France for temporary labor duty. By 1947, the vast majority were home. For many, the return was bittersweet. They left behind clean barracks, full meals, and safety for ruined cities and hungry families. One recalled, "When I came home, my children were thin and pale. I had to tell them that while they starved, I had eaten oranges and meat. I felt ashamed." Decades later, thousands of former POWs remembered their time in America, not with bitterness, but with gratitude. Some even returned as immigrants, drawn by the memory of a country that had treated them with dignity in their darkest hour. In the 1950s and 1960s, ex-POWs applied to move back to the United States. Some became farmers, others factory workers. Reunions between American farmers and their former POW laborers became touching reminders of wartime humanity. One former prisoner wrote in 1972, "I never forgot the kindness shown to me. America was the place where I first saw freedom, even behind barbed wire." The story of German POWs in America is more than a tale of meat, fruit, and chocolate. It is a lesson in power, propaganda, and humanity. By treating their captives fairly, the United States not only upheld the law, it won respect, undermined enemy ideology, and planted seeds of trust that would later help rebuild a broken Europe. But this story has another side. While Germans behind American fences ate pies and oranges, American prisoners in German camps lived on watery soup and crusts of bread. For them, captivity meant hunger, cold, and the struggle to survive. Their story is the shadow cast by the light of America's abundance. And it begins next. While German prisoners in America tasted meat, fruit, and chocolate, the story was very different for the Americans captured in Europe. For them, captivity meant hunger, cold, and a daily fight to survive. Most American soldiers were captured in Europe, in the forests of France, the frozen fields of the Battle of the Bulge, or in cities seized by German counterattacks. When they fell into German hands, they were forced to surrender their weapons, march with their hands raised, and join long columns of prisoners trudging toward the nearest rail depot. Transport was brutal. Prisoners were crammed into cattle cars meant for livestock. The air was foul, the space so tight that men could barely sit. Days passed with little food and almost no water. Many collapsed from exhaustion or dehydration. One American POW later recalled, "We were treated like animals. The stench was unbearable, and some men didn't survive the journey." Once inside Germany, prisoners were divided among different camps. Ordinary soldiers went to stalags, while officers were sent to oflags. The camps were bleak. Most were old barracks or hastily built huts surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. The barracks were overcrowded, filthy, and freezing. Beds were rough wooden planks with a thin layer of straw and one blanket, utterly inadequate for the German winter. Food was the prisoners' greatest torment. Breakfast might be a chunk of coarse black bread and a bitter drink made from roasted barley or acorns, passed off as coffee. Lunch was a watery soup with a few turnips or potatoes floating in it. Dinner brought another scrap of bread and maybe a boiled potato. Meat was rare. Many POWs went months without tasting it. Malnutrition was rampant. A soldier wrote in his diary, "Hunger gnawed at us constantly. A slice of bread became more valuable than gold. Men traded everything they had for an extra crumb." For many, salvation came in the form of Red Cross parcels. These packages contained canned meat, chocolate, cigarettes, jam, powdered milk, and sometimes coffee. They were lifelines. Without them, survival was doubtful. But delivery was unreliable. Sometimes parcels were delayed for weeks. Sometimes German guards confiscated or withheld them. When they did arrive, the contents were divided with meticulous fairness. Cigarettes became a form of currency inside the camps. One American POW later said, "Those Red Cross parcels were the difference between life and death. Without them, we wouldn't have made it." Cold was the second great enemy. Winters in Germany were bitter, and the barracks had little or no heating. Fuel was scarce. Prisoners burned scraps of wood, old shoes, even paper to warm their hands. Frostbite was common. One soldier recalled, "The cold broke us. At night, we huddled together under thin blankets, our bodies shaking until morning. Sometimes I prayed the sun would rise just to stop the misery." For many Americans, the knowledge of how German POWs were living in America made the contrast unbearable. News trickled into the camps, letters from home or intercepted articles that described Germans in U.S. camps eating full meals and even chocolate. One American POW wrote bitterly, "We were starving, yet back home the enemy was treated better than we were." It was a cruel irony that gnawed at us. Hunger and cold were only part of the nightmare. Inside the German camps, disease and despair spread like shadows. The cramped and filthy conditions were breeding grounds for sickness. Lice infested the straw mattresses and clothing. Dysentery was common, leaving men weak and dehydrated. Pneumonia and tuberculosis struck hard in the winter months, when thin blankets and inadequate food left immune systems shattered. Medical treatment was minimal. A few German doctors made rounds, but supplies were scarce and compassion scarcer. American medics among the prisoners tried to help with whatever they had, but with no antibiotics and little medicine, many illnesses ran their course unchecked. One POW wrote in a letter later, smuggled out, "We had no medicine, no bandages, no real doctors. Men coughed themselves to death. We could only watch. Death was never far away. Malnutrition led to bodies wasting away, cheeks sunken, ribs protruding, legs too weak to carry men across the muddy compounds. Some collapsed during roll call, others quietly in their bunks at night. The sick bay was a place of silence, filled with men too weak to lift their heads. Burials were grim affairs. Prisoners carried the bodies of their comrades beyond the barbed wire, where they were laid in simple wooden coffins or even shallow graves. There was little ceremony, only a chaplain's quiet prayer. Then the survivors marched back to their barracks, acutely aware that the same fate might await them soon. Morale was perhaps the hardest battle. The Germans controlled not just the bodies, but the minds of their captives. Daily roll calls were deliberately long, forcing prisoners to stand for hours in the cold. Punishments for minor infractions could mean solitary confinement in dark, freezing cells. Guards barked orders, sometimes with cruelty, sometimes with indifference. One POW later reflected, "They didn't need to beat us. Hunger and hopelessness were their weapons." Different camps offered different experiences. Some, like Stalag 7A in Moosburg, Bavaria, were massive, housing tens of thousands of Allied prisoners. Others, such as Oflag 4C, better known as Colditz Castle, were reserved for high-ranking officers and chronic escapees. Stalag Luft camps, run by the Luftwaffe, held captured airmen and were often better organized than those run by the regular army or SS. But even the better camps were harsh. Prisoners in Stalag Luft III, later made famous by The Great Escape, lived under strict surveillance. Food shortages still plagued them. They relied heavily on Red Cross parcels, and when those failed to arrive, conditions quickly deteriorated. Mental survival required creativity. Prisoners formed theater groups, staged plays, and even organized secret classes where men taught each other languages, mathematics, or history. These makeshift schools gave some prisoners a sense of purpose. "We had to keep our minds alive or we would go insane," one survivor recalled. Letters from home were treasured. Mail was censored and often delayed for months, but even a single page could lift spirits. Men read them over and over, clinging to words of family and home. Photographs became talismans tucked carefully into worn uniforms. Still, despair lingered. Some prisoners gave up, retreating into silence, their spirits broken. Others plotted escape, not only out of hope, but as a way to fight back. For many prisoners, the barbed wire fences symbolized despair. But for others, they became a challenge. If life inside the camps meant hunger, cold, and waiting for death, then the thought of escape, no matter how dangerous, offered a spark of hope. From the very beginning, Allied prisoners attempted to break out of German captivity. Some tried crude methods, cutting through wire under the cover of night, hiding under wagons, or slipping away during work details outside the camp. Others planned elaborate operations that required months of preparation. The most famous was Stalag Luft III, a camp deep in Silesia, run by the Luftwaffe for captured airmen. It became legendary for the Great Escape. Hundreds of Allied prisoners, including Americans, worked together to dig tunnels named Tom, Dick, and hairy. They built ventilation systems from tin cans, reinforced tunnel walls with stolen bedboards, and created tools from scrap metal. At night, they carried dirt out in secret pouches, scattering it around the compound so guards wouldn't notice. Prisoners forged documents, sewed civilian clothes from blankets, and memorized railway timetables. On the night of March 24, 1944, 76 men crawled through the tunnel and slipped into the forest. But the breakout was discovered before the last men could escape. A massive manhunt followed. Within days, all but 3 were recaptured. In a brutal act of reprisal, Hitler ordered 50 of the captured escapees executed. The massacre sent shockwaves through every POW camp. An American airman later said, "When we heard about the executions, we realized escape was no longer just dangerous. It was a death sentence." Yet attempts continued. Some prisoners tried over-the-wire escapes, sprinting under machine gun fire. Few survived. Others hid inside supply trucks leaving the camp, only to be discovered at checkpoints. Work details outside the camp offered rare opportunities. In farm fields or factories, a prisoner might slip away into nearby woods. But without maps, food, or knowledge of the terrain, most were quickly recaptured. For those who made it farther, survival depended on luck and help from civilians. A handful of Americans reached neutral Switzerland, often after grueling journeys across mountains. Others joined local resistance groups, fighting alongside partisans until liberation. But these stories were rare exceptions. The vast majority of escape attempts ended in failure. The punishment for getting caught varied. Some men were thrown into solitary confinement, tiny cells known as the cooler, where they endured weeks of darkness, cold, and bread and water rations. Others were beaten by guards. After the Great Escape, punishments became harsher, with escape considered almost a capital crime. Despite the risks, the will to escape never died. For many prisoners, it wasn't just about reaching freedom. It was about resisting, about proving that even behind barbed wire, the Allied spirit could not be broken. One American POW explained, "Planning escape gave us purpose. Even if we never made it out, we were fighting back in the only way we could." Not all resistance took the form of tunnels or daring flights. Some men engaged in small acts of defiance, refusing to salute German officers, sabotaging camp labor, or smuggling information. Others risked punishment by hiding radios, secretly listening to BBC broadcasts, and spreading news inside the camp. Hearing of Allied victories lifted morale. Every whispered headline was a spark of hope, recalled one prisoner. The Germans, aware of the psychological war being fought within their fences, increased surveillance. Guards conducted frequent searches, tearing apart bunks and confiscating anything suspicious. Still, ingenuity among the prisoners never ceased. They built false walls, hidden compartments, even entire rooms underground. Escape became a symbol of courage, of hope, of refusing to accept defeat. But for every successful breakout, there were countless failures. And behind each story was the harsh truth. Most prisoners would remain behind the wire until the war's end. As the Third Reich crumbled in 1945, the fate of thousands of American prisoners hung in the balance. Liberation was coming, but for many, the final months of captivity were the hardest of all. In January 1945, the Soviet Red Army surged westward, pushing German forces out of Poland. Terrified of their prisoners falling into Soviet hands, the Nazis began evacuating camps in the east. The result was the infamous death marches. Prisoners, weak, starving, and ill, were forced to march for days and weeks through snow and freezing winds. They carried what little they owned on their backs. Food was almost non-existent. Some were given only a crust of bread for an entire day. Guards shot stragglers who could not keep up. Those who collapsed on the roadside were often left to die in the snow. One American POW recalled, "We were skeletons, barely able to walk, yet they drove us on." Every step was agony. Men fell and never rose again. The marches stretched hundreds of miles. From camps like Stalag Luft 4, thousands of Allied prisoners staggered across Germany, leaving trails of suffering in their wake. Civilians sometimes offered help, an old woman handing out potatoes or children sneaking water, but such acts were rare and dangerous. By spring, the German war machine was collapsing. Allied armies advanced from the west, while Soviet forces pressed from the east. Camps became chaotic. Guards grew nervous, some abandoning their posts, others becoming more brutal in their final days of authority. Then, at last, liberation came. In April 1945, American and British forces began reaching camps across Germany. At places like Moosburg, the largest POW camp in Bavaria, U.S. tanks rolled through the gates to scenes of overwhelming emotion. Emaciated prisoners wept, laughed, and embraced their liberators. Some were too weak to stand. One liberator wrote in his journal, "They looked like ghosts. Hollow faces, rags for clothes, eyes filled with both suffering and relief. Yet when they saw our flag, a light came back into their eyes." For many, the joy of freedom was tempered by physical collapse. Men who had survived years of starvation and disease suddenly received proper food, and some died from eating too much too quickly. Medical teams rushed in to stabilize survivors. Hospitals filled with skeletal men, many weighing less than 100 pounds. Repatriation began almost immediately. Prisoners were flown to France or England, then shipped back to the United States. Families greeted them with tears and embraces, but behind the reunions lay invisible scars. The contrast with German POWs in America was not lost on anyone. While Germans had eaten meat, fruit, and chocolate, Americans returned home with sunken cheeks and haunted eyes. Newspapers reported the disparity, fueling debates about the ethics of wartime treatment. But for the soldiers themselves, the question was more personal. Survival had come at a terrible cost. Life after captivity was not easy. Many former POWs carried lifelong health problems, damaged lungs, weak hearts, chronic stomach issues from malnutrition. Others struggled with nightmares, anxiety, and what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. One veteran confessed, "The war ended for most in 1945. For us, it never really ended. We carried the camps inside us for the rest of our lives." Yet there was also resilience. Some ex-POWs rebuilt their lives with remarkable determination. They married, worked, raised families, and rarely spoke of their suffering. Others became advocates, ensuring their comrades' stories were not forgotten. The legacy of American POWs in Germany is a tale of endurance. It is about men who endured hunger, cold, and humiliation, yet found ways to hold on, through friendship, through faith, through sheer willpower. And when the barbed wire finally fell, they returned not as broken men, but as survivors. Survivors who bore witness to the cost of war, and who reminded the world that even in the darkest of places, the human spirit could endure. The story of prisoners of war is a story of contrasts. In America, German captives ate chocolate, oranges, and beef. In Germany, American captives starved on black bread and turnip soup. Both lived behind barbed wire, but their realities could not have been more different. These stories reveal not only the cruelty of war, but also the choices nations make regarding humanity. They show how food, shelter, and dignity can become weapons or gifts. And they remind us that even when freedom is stolen, the will to survive, to hope, and to resist can never be fully imprisoned.